Hello. During this session of the American presidency class, we will be talking about Congress and the presidency, the president's relationships with Congress. Uh, to begin, we review the president's formal and informal powers with respect to Congress, and then we will talk about sources of conflict between the president and Congress, and finally, we'll talk about presidential leadership of Congress, the various methods that presidents have of getting members of Congress to go along with their policy demands. So let's start the lecture slides on that by sharing the screen with my computer. And so this is the first of a two-part lecture series. So thinking about presidential roles relating to Congress. One of the chief things that the president does as president is work with Congress. In this task of working with Congress, the president affects the legislative agenda by sending legislative proposals. The president facilitates coalition building in Congress and consensus by providing advocacy for the presidential agenda. The president works with Congress in overseeing the efficiency and the effectiveness of bureaucracy through Congress's legislative oversight function. And then finally, Congress and the president will interact to provide casework, or in other words, favors for members of Congress. Thinking about congressional agenda setting for just a second, recall that the president is empowered to propose necessary and expedient measures under the Constitution. So this is where the president's agenda setting authority originates. Okay, presidents can rarely operate independently of Congress, in that Congress is the chief policymaker. Presidents can't alter policy at will. They are indeed policymakers, but they can't alter policy at will, but rather they are bound by the Constitution to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. In that charge to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, it's easy to see that presidents are sometimes hamstrung by the law. They may well execute laws that they do not agree with necessarily. And yet at the same time, Congress depends on the president for policy because the president is also a participant in the legislative process. Additionally, members of Congress depend on the president for policy implementation that is favorable to members of Congress. Generally, though not always, the executive has some discretion about such things as where to locate military bases, what jurisdictions get water funding and water projects. One of the biggest areas is actually sewer projects. So location decisions can generally enhance or hurt the standing of members of Congress. Favorable standing with the president by a legislator allows them to have leverage at home with their constituents and personally with Congress. If a legislator is successful in bringing home the bacon, if you will, then that enhances the standing of the legislator, both personally and among home constituents and within Congress. So the relationship between Congress and the presidency is symbiotic or endogenous, as we talked about earlier. It runs both ways. Congress needs the president and the president needs Congress. Few presidents are able to dominate Congress, except perhaps for a brief period after their initial election. Roosevelt dominated Congress from 1933 through around 1936. Lyndon Johnson dominated Congress in the period between 65, actually between 63 and 67. However, those two presidencies, Roosevelt and Johnson, are very rare exceptions to the rule of presidents being able to dominate Congress. Most presidents achieve their legislative goals only partially, though most also have a degree of success. Few presidents are totally ineffective either, usually achieving at least 50% of their agenda. While the data is not all in yet, Trump garnered a lot of support from Republicans during the first part of his presidency. And I'm going to go to that link in a moment, but just to summarize, Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was the largest tax cut since the Reagan era, and the First Step Law into the First Step Act into law, which was the Criminal Justice Reform Act, actually minimizing penalties for marijuana and other minor offenses. However, Trump was not very successful in achieving his major agenda items. He had promised during the 2016 election campaign that he was going to build a border wall and he was going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Neither of these items were successful, even during a period when he had unified Republican control of Congress during his first 2 years. During the first 2 years, Trump was facing a Congress that was fully Republican. And so you can see that presidents may not get what they want even when they face a unified Congress. Let's go to this, this link here on 538.com. And you can see that this article, it talks about the House being more polarized than ever. We'll talk about that later. And it talks some about members not crossing the aisle. And this statement here, the average House Republican has voted in line with Trump's position more than 98% of the time in the earliest part of his administration. So that's a pretty telling average, 98%. Thinking about theoretical models of presidential leadership of Congress, one prominent model in political science is called the bank account model. What this model argues is that the president has a reserve of influence, which is at a high mark the day he is inaugurated, and it diminishes after that. So you can think of a kind of a curve, declining curve, where his reserve of influence is high at the start and it declines steadily into the latter part of his administration. In other words, the president has political capital to spend, but that political capital is limited. It is time limited. The president's ability to persuade declines as his political capital declines, which may occur as a result of declining respect and declining popularity. Earlier, we talked about the public opinion and presidential approval ratings, and we noted that there is a long-term tendency during each presidency for approval ratings to decline. So that notion of declining approval implies declining political capital. When political capital is spent, the president has to do things to replenish it. And so this model implies the need for acting quickly on the part of the president and attempting to accomplish only a limited number of issues early in his administration. In contrast, there is an opposing model among political scientists called the political investment model. What this model argues is that presidents maximize power through a bargaining process. Successful bargaining comes as a result of being successful in previous bargains. So in other words, presidents can actually increase their power by being successful. The quality of a president's reputation or intra-Washington perceptions has a significant impact on a president's ability to get things done. If the president is perceived as highly expert and efficient, skilled at negotiation, if the president is perceived as having a lot of leadership qualities, if the president's public approval is high, these are all important factors that increase the president's reputation. Failures, on the other hand, may form a pattern that diminish the president's ability to lead. What matters is residual impressions of things like willingness to use power, tenacity, reputation, skill, the president's personal attributes. So with one model, the bank account model, the president's reserve of influence is limited, and he typically will never be able to get it back. Early in his administration, he is at a high point of influence. In contrast, the political investment argument would be that presidents can become more successful by exercising the assets that they have during the bargaining process. So the political investment model then contrasts with the bank account model in that it implies a positive feedback system. That is, greater success implies greater power, and greater power implies greater success. As the president invests political capital, he gets a return on the investment, which may increase his power through time. On the other hand, power can ebb and flow depending on the flow of investment and success on the part of the president. In the bank account model, the flow of capital tends to decline precipitously over time, and the president can never get it back. Okay, I want to right now review the president's formal and informal legislative powers. Earlier, we talked some about the president's formal powers. That was in the stuff that we did on the President and the Constitution. But I want to also talk about the president's informal legislative powers in this segment. Formally, the Constitution provides the president with 4 legislative responsibilities. 1, the president informs Congress from time to time on the State of the Union. As we noted earlier, this was done every year in person. Since Woodrow Wilson, it was done in writing after the first 2 presidents who also delivered the State of the Union in person. So this tool enables the president to affect the national and legislative agenda. A statement of what the president wants in the State of the Union and is attending to. A scholar named Jeffrey Cohen, who is at Fordham University in New York, did research that indicates that the State of the Union precedes and may cause public attention to an issue. What Jeffrey did was he looked at the Gallup time series on public attentiveness to issues. What issues does the public care about? And he looked at that time series on what issues matter most at a particular time just prior to the State of the Union message. And then after the State of the Union address, he looked at the next Gallup report on what people were paying attention to. What is the most important problem that people perceive? And what Cohen found was that the State of the Union message affected how people perceive public problems. Increasing presidential attention to an issue resulted in increased public attention to an issue. Interestingly, Cohen's research followed up immediately after the State of the Union and then several months after that. And what he found was that several months after that, the effect had disappeared. So what's the lesson from Cohen's research? It is that presidents are able to produce a short-term effect on public attention to an issue, what the public is attending to, but that effect tends to dissipate very, very quickly through time. Presidents don't produce long-term effects. Presidents also recommend necessary and expedient legislation. The president is a central figure who is the only one nationally elected and represented a national constituency. At times, the president has recommended emergency legislation under this necessary and expedient clause, but it's taken generally as being enabling the president to propose legislation generally. The president, thirdly, can summon Congress into special session and adjourn it if the two houses can't agree on a time of adjournment. 27 sessions of Congress have been convened by presidents in the history of Congress. John Adams was the first president to call the Congress into special session in 1797 over suspending relations with France. And this pertains to Adams and the U.S. and the quasi-war with France. Franklin Roosevelt called Congress into special session on March 9th of 1933. The next 100 days was the most productive in American history. The last president to convene Congress into special session was President Harry Truman in 1948. And he did so to urge enactment of his domestic legislative agenda that was intended to expand New Deal programs. Truman's call for a special session was done in a direct political context. He had issued his intention to call a special session from the Democratic Convention platform when he was renominated to be the nominee for the Democrats. Congress's failure to pass the domestic bills in that special session led to Truman's 1948 campaign slogan, "The Do-Nothing 80th Congress." But following Truman's calling of a special session, this power of the president has not been used. Finally, the president is empowered in the legislative process to exercise a qualified veto. This is extremely important in that it positions the president as a co-participant in the legislative process. The president can threaten or act. In either case, Congress has to always anticipate the president and to act strategically. At times, Congress may, in recognition that a veto is forthcoming, take symbolic actions. For example, the Republican House Republican repeal of the assault weapon ban, and they did this knowing that Clinton would veto the bill. Congress can at times satisfy constituencies when it knows there is no prospect for change. There is some really important work on the presidential veto, done by Chuck Cameron, who is a scholar at Princeton University. He has written a book entitled Veto Bargaining, and his book is game theoretic in nature, but it demonstrates the importance of veto powers in affecting legislative behavior. He shows that not only does the veto itself affect legislative behavior, but also the threat of a veto can affect legislative behavior as the president and the Congress bargain strategically over what goes into impending legislation. Beyond those four constitutional powers that I just identified, the president is also bound by law in the legislative process. The law requires the president to provide an annual economic report on the state of the economy, and this is mandated to the president by the Employment Act of 1946 and the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978. I've placed a hot link here to the annual economic report This is a website that is maintained by the Fed. Let's just go there very briefly. You can see this is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, I think. They don't really say here, but in any case, to view an economic report of the president, you simply click this link here, and it will take you to that particular economic report of the president. And they have the economic reports going all the way back to the beginning in 1946. So you can see that the economic report of the president is here, and also the annual report of the Council of Economic Advisors. Okay, by law, the president is also required to submit a proposed budget to Congress. And I think, as we've talked about earlier, this was started by the Budgeting Accounting Act of 1921 and then amended in the 1974 Budget Act. Informally, and now those two are required by law. Informally, the president is also expected to formulate, propose, and promote policies through coalition building, both on Capitol Hill and among the general public. The president is expected to informally coordinate policies within the executive branch. But as the president does these things, as it exercises its formal and informal powers, sources of conflict arise between the president and Congress. Presidents are co-participants in the legislative process, but they can't always expect cooperation from Congress. The relationship between the president and Congress has tended, particularly in the modern era, to be a conflictual one. The reason is partisanship. The president and Congress may be of different political parties. Indeed, a unified Congress has existed for only 18 of the last 33 years since 1980. Between 1933 and 1980, a unified Congress existed for all years except 1947, 48, and 53, and 54. So since 1980, facing Congress, different presidents have experienced different circumstances. We can go to this Wikipedia link here, and we can kind of verify what I'm talking about. What we have here is a listing of the divisions of Congress by party. And I guess the better way to look at it here is with the graph. I think I've showed this graph earlier. This graph is actually on a different Wikipedia page earlier. So you can see that from 1933 to 1980, which is right here, we saw a unified Democratic Congress in all but 4 years, 48 to 49 and 53 to 54. Since 1980, we've only seen a Democratic unified Congress twice during this period between, this is, looks like 87 to 88 to 97. And then during this 2 years of the Obama administration. Other than that, we've seen divided government. We've seen unified Republican control of government, of Congress rather, during this red period here, this red period here, and this red period here. Okay, but you can see that presidents since 1980 have faced a much more difficult problem in governing than presidents prior to 1980 because of the prevalence of divided party government. Okay, another factor that affects the president's conflict with Congress is constituency. Even if presidents and members of Congress are of the same political party, there's also a fundamental disagreement that will occur because they represent different constituencies. The president is more global in his mode of representation, representing the nation at large. On the other hand, members of Congress may place some priority on global influences, but in fact, they represent smaller subsets of the larger public. Members of Congress tend to have a more parochial outlook, and they are highly responsive to their constituents. They tend to be more responsive to interest groups as well than the president does. The Senate tends to overrepresent rural states because it provides 2 senators regardless of population, which may make it more protective of rural values and rural interests. Of course, if we think about the population in a state like Idaho or Montana, the fact that it has 2 senators compared to the 2 senators from California and New York and Texas implies that there's a vested state interest associated with senatorial representation. The Senate overrepresents rural states and small population states, as I'm noting here. Another source of conflict between the president and members of Congress is their different time horizons. Members of Congress tend to remain in office for a longer period than the president. In the Senate, the typical representative member of the Senate lasts about 12 years. And that's much longer for the leadership of the Senate. How do I know it's about 12 years? Well, I did a study that actually took the average of Senate duration in that chamber, and I found that it was about 12 years, a little more than 12 years, but not much more. House members are up for re-election more often than the president and the Senate, and therefore they are the most responsive to constituent and narrow interests. In the Senate, 2/3 of the senators are not up for re-election at the same time as the president. This means that senators may represent starkly different electoral coalitions than the president, given that coalitions can change dramatically over time. Senators may also be insulated from the forces which determine the presidency due to that different electoral cycle. In contrast, the presidential term is limited to 8 years, and many presidents serve only 4. The president wants to do things now, while the Congress may be less concerned with getting things done now or with the timing of things. In fact, there is a tendency of members of Congress to move far more slowly than the president wants to move. Organization is another source of conflict between the president and Congress. The Congress is a highly decentralized institution. It is fragmented by cross-cutting interests, subcommittee structure, and diverse coalitions independent of partisanship. There is little ability to enforce discipline on members, especially since 1974 and the de-emphasis of seniority in designating chairs and leaders. Because of its decentralization, Congress has an inability to consider issues of policy coordination, but rather considers issues serially, one after the other. This ensures a diversity of views will be represented and that many interests will have access. However, this may also mean deadlock and opposition to almost any policy that is proposed. The decentralized structure of Congress is also not conducive to accountability. Congress is often in a critical mode rather than taking responsibility for its actions. Congress can make irresponsible decisions and then shift the blame to others. It's easier to blame the executive when in fact the fault may be with the Congress. In contrast, the executive is hierarchically organized. Accountability is clearly focused on the executive when things go wrong. the chief executive is in a better position to coordinate policy and policy making. If another source of conflict between the president and Congress relates to their different levels of expertise. The president has greater sources of expertise than Congress as a general matter. Bureaucratic expertise, executive branch expertise is enormous. Additionally, within the EOP, the Office of Management and Budget has various types of experts. The president can also appoint blue ribbon commissions to study various policy issues. Congress, on the other hand, tends to employ generalists. Members of Congress are generalists. They are, for the most part, attorneys or businessmen or other aspects. Very few scientists in Congress, and the scientific mode of thinking is something that is often foreign to members of Congress. However, since 1974, Congress and its expertise have been increased. Congress sensed, as a result of the Johnson-Nixon era, that there was a harmful imbalance in expertise between the president and the legislative branch. And thus, in 1974, was created the Government Accountability Office. Its name originally was the General Accounting Office. Also, Congress has the Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress. It had the Office of Technology Assessment until Republicans dismantled it in 1995. It also has the Congressional Budget Office. So looking at these offices more particularly, let's go to the Government Accountability Office link that I've got here. And we have a description of this office. It says the U.S. Government Accountability Office is an independent, nonpartisan agency that works for Congress. Often called the Congressional Watchdog, the GAO examines how taxpayer dollars are spent and provides Congress and federal agencies with objective, reliable information to help the government save money and work more efficiently. And then it goes on, and you can click the other links here in order to understand GAO more in depth than I'm giving here. But basically, it's what it is an office that works for Congress and attempts to oversee how taxpayer dollars are spent. Just a note here before I leave the site is that the Comptroller General is the head of the GAO, and he interacts with Congress to serve the American people. So again, the Comptroller General and the GAO are important aspects of congressional expertise. Congress also has the Congressional Research Service, and let's go here briefly, and then I'll describe what the benefit is here. It says the Congressional Research Service works exclusively for the United States Congress, providing policy and legal analysis to committees and members of both the House and the Senate, regardless of party affiliation. As a legislative branch agency within the Library of Congress, CRS has been a valued and respected resource on Capitol Hill for more than a century. CRS is well known for analysis that is authoritative, confidential, objective, and nonpartisan. Its highest priority is to ensure that Congress has 24/7 access to the nation's best thinking. So let's think about what we just read. It provides a service to members of Congress and committees of Congress. Any member of Congress or committee of Congress can ask the Congressional Research Service to do a study, and the Congressional Research Service will do that study. There are literally thousands of Congressional Research Service studies in existence. This source of information tends to be unbiased. tends to be highly technical and highly skilled in the assessment of whatever policy is being studied by a member or a committee of Congress. And so this is a source of congressional expertise where all members of Congress have to do is call on the agency, the CRS, to do its task, and they will get a response. The Congressional Budget Office, the last of these links that is good here. Okay, so the Congressional Budget Office will evaluate the budgetary situation for the United States from a congressional perspective. We noted in a prior lecture that the White House has the Office of Management and Budget. Sometimes OMB's budget is akin to what presidents want, and that may not be what Congress wants. And so CBO, Congressional Budget Office, will conduct nonpartisan analyses of the budgetary matters for members of Congress. CBO tends to be a more credible source than OMB does, by the way. Again, members of Congress tend to be generalists along with their staffs. They have different information and expertise and tend to produce different outlooks and policy orientations. As a result, they reach different decisions based on those different perspectives. Presidents do have various sources of leadership for Congress, of things they can do to help lead Congress. And of course, the biggest one, we talked about this some earlier, is the political party. We noted earlier that we don't have a responsible party system in the sense that there's a norm that party members always vote with the party position. However, if we want to predict the determinant of votes in Congress, the best predictor of the vote of individual congressmen is partisanship. Their party ID is a powerful explanation for vote outcomes. Of course, the president is the nominal leader of the incumbent political party, and so he can count on some support from fellow partisans. Note, however, that with increasing party polarization through time, we have come closer to a responsible party system than we were in the past, especially if we have the president and members of Congress being of the same party. Of course, that wouldn't apply if the president and members of Congress are not of the same party. Recent experience, however, shows that even with unified government, presidents may not get what they want. We can get a handle on that by looking at CQ's presidential support scores. What is a congressional quarterly presidential support score? Congressional quarterly roll call editors select presidential support votes each year based on clear statements by the president or the president's authorized spokesperson. Success scores show the percentage of the selected votes on which the president prevailed in Congress. Support shows the percentage of roll call votes on which the members of Congress voted in agreement with the president's position. Here are some graphs that demonstrate these effects based on CQ presidential support scores. At that hot link there is more than I just gave on CQ presidential support scores, so I encourage you to visit that. Okay, so here's a graph of presidential support scores from 1954 through 2016. We'll look at Trump in a few minutes, but you can see through time that the incumbent party, whether that's Democrat or Republican, has had higher support scores than the out party does. Again, we looked at that from a different graphical perspective in an earlier lecture, but this is the same data presented in a different way. But the idea here is that, let's just take Eisenhower. For Eisenhower, between 54, 53, 54, and about 61, 60, you see that Democrat support for Eisenhower was pretty high, and Republican support for Eisenhower was even higher. We begin to see a divergence with support for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson being very high in the during the 61 through about 67 period, and even near the time when Johnson was ending his term. You can see presidential support scores are very high among Democrats. They're lower among Republicans. Notice the pattern for the out party through time. You can see that by the time we get to Obama, and actually George W. Bush, for George W. Bush, we have incredibly high presidential support. Same thing for Obama, on the same par as what we had with the Kennedy and Johnson era, actually a little higher than the Kennedy and Johnson era. But the Democrat support for George W. Bush, especially during the near the end of George W. Bush's term, was very, very low. Similarly, with Barack Obama, we see very high Democratic support for Obama, and then year by year, we see Republican support drop off to less than 10% in 2016. So that's the House of Representatives. We tell a pretty similar story, although less extreme, for the Senate. And you can see here for the Senate, the story is pretty similar for Eisenhower and Kennedy. But look up here at George W. Bush and Obama, and you can see that very high support scores among the in-party, but not so low as in the House of Representatives for the out-party. So senators tended to be less polarized than did House members during both George W. Bush and Obama's terms. Of course, senators represent states, whereas members of the House represent districts within the states. And so what we have here is a manifestation of the idea that states and the Senate representation tends to be more rural in nature and small state in nature. Okay, so let's go back to our lecture slides. And okay, so standing by their man in both terms of his first term, both years of his first term. This goes up to 2018. Donald Trump enjoyed record support from Congress on bills where he took a clear position. He received the second highest second-year support of any president going back to Eisenhower. One reason for the high scores, though, is Trump took a stance on fewer bills than many of his predecessors had. Okay, so you look at the graphical data presented here. This is CQ's data. You can see that in 2018, 93.4% of Republicans voted with the president, and even more in 2017 voted with the president. So again, this notion of standing by their man was even greater during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. So thinking about that in more depth, whether he was pushing his administration's agenda or just endorsing the efforts of congressional Republicans, Donald Trump got his way nearly every time he made a position known. The share of votes on which the president took a clear position was only 5.1%. That was the lowest percentage on record for House measures. The share of votes where the president took a clear position in the Senate was 36%, which was the highest first-year rate since John Kennedy. And the president took a position on 117 out of 325 matters that came before the House and Senate. The average for both chambers was 14.8%, where the president took a position. How often did the president win when taking a position? 100% in the House. This was the first time on record. So Trump engendered loyalty that was sky high in the House. All of the votes where the president took a position, it was a low number, 5.1%, but 36 out of 36 times the president won in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, the president won on 115 out of 117 measures. In other words, 98.3%. This was second highest to Obama's 98.7% in 2009. The average for both chambers was 98.7%. Average chamber presidential support scores for the House, 93% for Republicans, 16% for Democrats, and then for the Senate, 96% for Republicans and only 37% for Democrats. So we get a sense that Trump has engendered more loyalty among Republicans than virtually any prior president. Furthermore, he has engendered more opposition among Democrats than any other president. So note that the presidential opposition goes up when the other party is in office. And we've seen that already. With a president of their own in the White House, party members may alter their voting tendencies. Republicans then have a tendency to be more supportive of internationalist foreign policy and are more likely to accept governmental economic activity when there's a Republican in the White House. Example, Republicans supported foreign aid and increasing the national debt ceiling during the early years of the Reagan administration. Of course, these are measures they opposed during the earlier Carter administration. Similarly, on health care, many of the elements of the 2010 Affordable Care Act were supported and even proposed previously by Republicans in 1994. So there's a bit of irony in that. While the president then can count on a base level of support from his own political party, there's still no guarantee of success. In earlier times, Southern Democrats in particular were known for partisan switching before 1980. Presidents need a pretty large majority by their party in Congress in order to prevail, as well as loyalists. And that means that for the president to be successful, he has to sometimes take an activist position as party leader. Of course, the president's support from the other party is a function of how polarized Congress is. Here's a slide that shows a measure of congressional polarization from my recent work on this topic. Polarization ranges from 0 to 1 on a left-hand scale. Okay, so what we have here is House and Senate polarization from 1950 through 2012 based on Americans for Democratic Action votes. And you can see that the measure ranges from 0 to 1. Polarization for the Democrats was between 0.6, just an average about 0.65, I guess, maybe a little lower than 0.65 in the period before 1980. And polarization for Republicans was about 0.8 prior to 1980. But then after 1980, what we see is that Republican and Democratic polarization starts to increase in the House. Observe also that contrary to popular belief, Democratic polarization in the House increases more sharply than Republican polarization does. Notice, however, that Republicans were already more polarized than Democrats were. They both reached about the same point by 2012 on average. And so what we see is that Republicans, even though they grew less sharply polarized, following 1980. They were already more polarized than the Democrats, and the two parties are near the same in their level of polarization in the House of Representatives. We see a similar pattern on the right-hand side of this graph with the Democrats not being very polarized at all, about 0.65 on the polarization scale from 0 to 1. Republicans were actually declining in polarization prior to 1980. They went from 1950 through 1980 from over 0.85 down to about 0.7. So they were declining in polarization. And then following 1980, the two political parties began increasing in their polarization in pretty much unison, with the Democrats and Republicans becoming more and more polarized in the Senate. Additionally, presidents must attempt wherever possible to convert members of the other party. In particular, Clinton, as we noted earlier, had to rely on members of the Republican Party to get NAFTA through Congress. The Democratic leadership in both houses of Congress opposed NAFTA, so that there was a bipartisan coalition that ended up being responsible for the passage of NAFTA. Most of that coalition was Republican, with some Democrats joining in with the Republicans to get NAFTA passed in 1994. So a question in democratic theory: is it partisanship or some other factor that makes presidents of the same party vote with the president? Is it ideology or similarity of views? Is it constituency? Is it loyalty to the president? Notice that there must be a collinearity issue with this, and that it's difficult to disentangle what causes what in this relationship. Okay, another factor concerning presidential leadership in Congress is leading the political party. That members of the president's party are more susceptible to influence is quite clear. Members of the president's own party have personal loyalties and commitments to their party leader, which the president can translate into votes when necessary. Members of the president's party give the president the benefit of the doubt, especially when a personal or constituency preference is weak. Members of the president's party have an incentive to make the president look good because it makes the party look good. Some may feel a sense of gratification for presidential coattails. Okay, at this point, we have reached the conclusion of our prepared slides for part 1 of the lessons on the President and Congress. In this lecture, we have emphasized the President's formal and informal powers with respect to Congress. And then also we've talked about sources of conflict between the President and Congress. And then finally, we talked about sources of presidential leadership of Congress. So we'll stop there and resume at a later date. Have a nice afternoon and enjoy your time off.